Once upon a time, in the sun-baked, bustling streets of Alaba International Market, where the air hung thick with the smell of roasted corn and exhaust fumes, where traders shouted over one another in a desperate symphony of survival, where motorcycle horns screamed through narrow pathways choked with bodies and goods and dreams, there lived a young woman named Aisha, 22 years old, orphaned by a tragedy that had ripped through her life like a machete through sugarcane. Her parents, good people who had loved her fiercely, had been taken in an instant on the third mainland bridge, crushed between two trailer trucks in the chaos that Lagos traffic so often became. She had been 17 then, standing at their graveside with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hollow echo of her mother's last words ringing in her ears. Be kind, always be kind. And so she had been, even as the world showed her no kindness in return. Now she lived under the roof of her uncle, a man whose greed had eaten away whatever family loyalty might have once existed in his heart. Every morning before the sun rose, Aisha was already at the market, her small table spread with groundnuts roasted to perfection, bottles of zobo that she made with her own hands, and colourful scarves she bought wholesale and sold for margins so thin they barely kept her alive. She worked from dawn until the market lights flickered on at night, her hands perpetually stained, her body perpetually exhausted. And every evening, her uncle waited at the door of his cramped compound, his palm extended, demanding every naira she had earned. He took it all, leaving her with just enough to buy Gary and a small tin of sardines if she was lucky. He called her a burden. He called her worthless. He told her repeatedly that she was nothing but dead weight in his house, that she should be grateful he hadn't thrown her into the street like the garbage she was. But Aisha endured. She had learned to make herself small, to move through the world like a ghost, to avoid her uncle's anger and his fists when the anger became too much. She had learned to smile at customers even when her heart was breaking, to give small portions of groundnuts to the street children who begged at her table, to share her zobo with the old women who had no money but came to her stall anyway for a kind word. In a market where everyone fought tooth and nail for survival, Aisha remained soft. And perhaps that was her greatest weakness, or perhaps it was her greatest strength. There was a man in the market, a beggar whom everyone knew but no one truly saw. His name was Malik, though few bothered to learn it. He wore a torn kaftan that had once been white but was now the colour of dust and neglect. His hair was wild, matted, his beard unkempt. His eyes, though, those eyes burned with something that made people uncomfortable, something too intelligent, too knowing for a man who slept in doorways and spoke in riddles. He would wander through the market asking strange questions, philosophical musings that made traders shake their heads and walk away. "What is the price of a soul?" he would ask. "Can you sell kindness by the kilo?" The market people thought him mad, touched by something dark or divine, and they avoided him when they could. But Aisha, she always gave him a handful of groundnuts when he passed her table, and she never asked for anything in return. She never knew he was watching her, studying her, measuring the content of her character with the precision of a scientist, conducting an experiment on humanity itself. Then came the day her uncle's patience ran out entirely. He stormed into the market one afternoon, his face twisted with rage, and something else, something that looked almost like triumph. He grabbed Aisha by her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises, and he dragged her through the crowd as people stopped to stare. She stumbled after him, her heart pounding, knowing that whatever was coming would be terrible. He took her back to his house and threw her into the small room where she slept on a mat on the floor, and he told her with cruel satisfaction that he had found a solution to his burden. He had arranged a marriage. Tomorrow she would be wed. The groom was already chosen. She opened her mouth to protest, to beg, to plead, but he raised his hand and she flinched into silence. The groom, he told her with a laugh that held no humour, was Malik the beggar, that mad fool who wandered the market speaking nonsense. He had agreed to take her off his hands for nothing, not even a bride price. Just take her and be gone. Her uncle would finally be free. Aisha felt her world collapse inward, felt the last small flame of hope that had been burning in her chest gutter, and die. To be married to a beggar, to a madman, to be cast out even lower than she already was, it seemed impossibly cruel. But neither Aisha nor the entire Alaba market could imagine the truth hiding behind Malik's wild eyes. The wedding took place in a small, run-down church on the edge of the market district, a building that looked like it had been forgotten by both God and man. The walls were cracked, great fissures running through the plaster like scars. The wooden benches were covered in dust, and only a handful of flickering bulbs provided any light in the dim interior. The pastor was clearly doing this as a favour, or perhaps for a small fee from her uncle. He rushed through the vows as if the words themselves were an inconvenience, his voice monotone and disinterested. There were no flowers, no music, no guests save for her uncle and two of his friends who had come to witness the disposal of his burden. No one congratulated them. No one smiled. Aisha stood in her market clothes, the best she owned, a simple wrapper and blouse, and she felt the tears sliding down her cheeks, though she made no sound. This was her wedding day, and it felt like a funeral. Malik stood beside her, and for the first time since she had known him, he was clean. Someone had made him bathe, had combed his hair and beard, though he still wore the same torn kaftan. But his demeanour was different. He wasn't muttering to himself or staring off into space. He was calm, unnaturally calm, and he watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His eyes weren't wild now. They were focused, laser-focused, and they seemed to be studying her soul, measuring something she couldn't name. When the pastor told him to place the ring, there was no ring. When they were pronounced man and wife, no one clapped. Her uncle shook Malik's hand, his relief palpable, and then he turned and walked out of the church without a backward glance at his niece. Aisha felt something inside her die in that moment, some last connection to family, to belonging, to home. But on that very day, a powerful man, dressed as a beggar, made a silent decision, one that would shake Lagos to its core in only 7 days. They went to Malik's dwelling, which turned out to be a tiny broken room behind an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the market. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was dirt. There was a single mattress on the ground, and nothing else. No electricity, no running water, just a kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Aisha sat on the mattress and pulled her knees to her chest, her mind blank with shock and grief. Malik said nothing. He simply nodded at her once, then turned and walked out into the night, leaving her alone. She cried then, truly cried, her body shaking with sobs that she had been holding back for years. She cried for her parents, for her stolen youth, for the life she would never have. She cried herself to sleep on that dirty mattress, and when she woke in the morning, Malik was gone. This became the pattern. Every day he would disappear before dawn, and she would be left alone in that broken room, with nothing to do and nowhere to go. She didn't return to the market. She didn't know if she was allowed to. She existed in a strange limbo, neither free nor imprisoned, waiting for something she couldn't name. But Malik, he left things for her. The first day she found bread and eggs sitting on an old crate near the door. The second day there was fruit and a bottle of clean water. The third day a new wrapper and blouse, still in their packaging, far nicer than anything she had ever owned. He never left a note, never explained, but his small kindnesses kept her alive and made her wonder who this strange man she had married truly was. On the fourth night, her uncle appeared at the door of the warehouse, drunk and belligerent. He pounded on the thin walls and shouted for Aisha, called her a useless girl who should be grateful for what he had done for her. He pushed his way into the room, his hand raised to strike her, as he had done so many times before. But before his palm could connect with her face, Malik was there. He had appeared from the shadows like a ghost, and he caught her uncle's wrist in mid-air. The change in Malik's voice was shocking. It was no longer the rambling, uncertain voice of a beggar. It was cold, commanding, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed without question. He told her uncle to leave, told him he was no longer welcome, told him that if he ever laid a hand on Aisha again, he would regret it for the rest of his life. There was something in Malik's eyes that made her uncle stumble backward, something terrifying and absolute. He left without another word, and Aisha stared at Malik in confusion and awe. Who was this man? The mysteries multiplied. She woke one night to find him sitting in the corner with a cracked tablet, his fingers flying across the screen with practiced precision, his face illuminated by the blue glow. The device looked expensive, completely out of place in their poverty. She pretended to be asleep, but she watched him through slitted eyes, her heart racing. And then there were the visitors. 3 times in the week, men in dark suits arrived late at night, stepping carefully through the warehouse debris to reach their room. They spoke to Malik in low, urgent tones, and they called him Sir. They treated him with a deference that made no sense, that turned her world upside down. Who were these people? What was Malik hiding? She wanted to ask, but fear kept her silent. Fear and something else, a growing curiosity that burned brighter each day. And on the 7th morning, Alaba would wake to a sight so unbelievable. People would swear the heavens had opened. The sound came first, a deep, rhythmic thumping that grew louder and louder until it felt like the air itself was vibrating. Aisha was jolted awake by the roar of helicopter blades, massive and overwhelming, shaking the thin walls of their room until dust rained down from the ceiling. She stumbled outside, her heart in her throat, and looked up to see 2 military-grade helicopters circling overhead, their downdraft sending market debris spiraling into the air. Traders were screaming, running, pointing at the sky. The helicopters were descending toward an empty field just beyond the market, a space that was usually used for parking trailers. And then she saw it, a sleek jet gleaming like a dream, touching down on the dirt as if the field had been made for exactly this purpose. The market had come to a complete standstill. Thousands of people stood frozen, staring, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Malik emerged from their room, and Aisha's breath caught in her throat. He walked toward the field with purpose, his torn kaftan billowing behind him, his spine straight, his head high. The helicopters had landed now, and from them emerged men in tactical gear, highly trained, moving with military precision. They formed a protective perimeter around Malik as he approached. Aisha felt her knees go weak. The door opened and 2 more men descended carrying a garment bag and a briefcase. They unzipped the bag right there in the field, and Aisha watched in stunned silence as they helped Malik remove his torn kaftan and dressed him in a tailored suit. Navy blue and perfectly fitted, with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. They handed him leather shoes that he slipped on without hesitation. In seconds, the beggar was gone, and in his place stood a man who looked like he owned the world. Aisha's mind couldn't process what she was seeing. She thought he was being arrested, that this was some kind of military raid, that she was about to lose him to forces she couldn't understand. She started to run toward him, terror propelling her forward, but one of the men in suits gently intercepted her and explained in a calm voice that everything was fine, that she needed to come with them. Her uncle had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his eyes wide with shock and greed. He pushed through the gathering masses, trying to reach Malik, trying to position himself as a connection, as family. But when he called out, when he tried to approach, Malik turned and looked at him with an expression of such cold dismissal that the uncle froze in his tracks. Malik's voice carried across the field, clear and final. Your chapter in her life has ended. Those words hung in the air like a judgment from on high, and her uncle stumbled backward as if he had been struck. The men in suits guided Aisha toward one of the helicopters, and she climbed in on legs that felt like water. Malik followed, settling into the seat beside her with an ease that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before. The door closed, the engines roared to life, and they lifted into the sky. Below them, Alaba International Market grew smaller and smaller, the crowd still gathered, staring up at the impossible sight. They flew over Lagos, over the traffic and the chaos and the sprawling neighborhoods, and Aisha pressed her face to the window, tears streaming down her cheeks, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear and disbelief. They landed at Murtala Muhammad International Airport, but not at the main terminal. They touched down on a private section of the tarmac where the jet waited, sleek and powerful and utterly surreal. But as the jet's doors closed behind them, Aisha realized she had married someone far more dangerous and far more important than she ever imagined. Inside the jet, the world transformed again. The interior was all leather and polished wood, glowing screens embedded in the walls, seats that looked more comfortable than any bed she had ever known, The engines were so quiet she could barely hear them, just a soft hum that felt more like a heartbeat than a machine. Malik sat across from her, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. She was trembling, her hands clutched together in her lap, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. And then he began to speak, and his voice was different again, gentler now, tinged with something that might have been regret or shame or both. His real name was Malik Adamu Usman, and he was 34 years old. He was a tech mogul, a reclusive genius who had built an empire from nothing, starting with code he had written in a tiny apartment in Yaba, and scaling it to operations that spanned from Silicon Valley to Johannesburg to Singapore. He had created systems that powered communications across Africa, platforms that had changed how people accessed information and conducted business. He was worth more money than Aisha could conceptualize, though he had always lived modestly, always stayed out of the public eye. But 2 years ago, he had been betrayed. His business partner, a man he had trusted like a brother, had stolen from him, had leaked proprietary information, had tried to destroy everything Malik had built. There had been accusations, investigations, his name dragged through the mud. Rather than fight in the court of public opinion, rather than wage a war that would consume years of his life, Malik had chosen to disappear. He had disguised himself as a beggar, had walked away from his life and his wealth, and had gone into hiding to gather evidence and rebuild his case in secret. But more than that, he had wanted to test something. If kindness was real or just a performance people put on when it benefited them. So he had wandered the markets and the streets dressed as the lowest of the low, and he had watched. He had watched people spit on him, curse him, kick him when he was down. He had watched the world reveal its ugliness in 1,000 small cruelties. And then he had watched Aisha. He had seen her give away food she couldn't afford to give. He had seen her comfort crying children, share her water with strangers, smile at people who treated her like dirt. He had tested her again and again, and every time she had passed. Every time she had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. And so he had made his decision. He would marry her, not out of pity, but out of respect. He would tie his life to hers because she represented the humanity he thought he had lost. Aisha listened to all of this, and when he finished speaking, she didn't know whether to scream or laugh or cry. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. The injustice of being used as an experiment, no matter how noble the intention. The impossibility of her situation. But she also heard the pain in his voice, the genuine anguish of a man who had been broken by betrayal and was trying desperately to believe in something good. But Aisha had no idea that Malik's greatest secret was still locked away, and it would soon test both their hearts. The jet carried them across the Sahara, over landscapes that seemed to belong to another world entirely. They landed at a hidden facility, a villa built into the desert itself, powered by solar panels that glinted like mirrors under the relentless sun. The compound was guarded by drones that circled silently overhead, and the walls were reinforced, invisible from a distance but impenetrable up close. Inside, the villa was cool and quiet, a sanctuary carved out of the harshness of the desert. Aisha stepped through the door and felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. True safety, true comfort. There were soft carpets, comfortable furniture, a kitchen stocked with food, a bathroom with running water that was actually hot. She stood under the shower for an hour, washing away the grime and the fear and the years of suffering, watching it all swirl down the drain. In the days that followed, something unexpected began to happen. Malik taught her how to code, sitting beside her at a computer and patiently explaining the logic, the structure, the beauty of programming. She was a quick learner, her mind sharp despite years of being told she was worthless. And she taught him in return, sharing the proverbs and wisdom of Lagos, the street smarts she had accumulated, the ways to read people and situations that had kept her alive. They cooked together, simple meals that somehow tasted better than anything she had ever eaten. They sat on the roof at night and watched the stars, and they talked, really talked, about their lives and their pain and their fears. Malik told her about the betrayal, how it had shattered his faith in people, how it had made him question everything he had built. And one night, he broke down completely. his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Aisha moved to his side and held him, this powerful man who had everything and nothing all at once, and she whispered the same words her mother had once whispered to her. Be kind, always be kind. In that moment, she gave him the compassion he thought humanity lacked, and something shifted between them, something real and fragile and precious. Yet, just as their hearts began to heal, news came that would shatter everything Malik thought he knew. A message arrived on his secure tablet, delivered by encrypted channels that only a handful of people in the world could access. The business partner who had betrayed him, the man who had stolen and lied and destroyed, had been arrested. International law enforcement had finally gathered enough evidence, and he was in custody, facing charges that would put him away for decades. More than that, Malik's name had been cleared, every accusation had been investigated and dismissed. His empire, which had been operating under the stewardship of trusted lieutenants, was waiting for his return. He was free to reclaim his life, free to step back into the light. But instead of joy, Malik felt crushing shame. He looked at Aisha, at this woman who had suffered so much already, and he realized what he had done. He had manipulated her life, had married her as part of an experiment, had tested her without her knowledge or consent. He had dragged her into his world not because he loved her, but because he needed to prove a point to himself. The guilt ate at him, and he confessed everything, his voice breaking. He told her she was free to leave, that he would provide for her, that she owed him nothing. He expected anger, rage, bitterness. But Aisha simply looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes, and she said something that would echo in his heart for the rest of his life. You tested the world, but the world also tested you. And we both passed. She had seen his brokenness and had chosen to stay anyway, not out of obligation or fear, but because in that broken man she had found someone who understood pain as deeply as she did. In the desert villa, surrounded by silence and stars, Malik vowed to rewrite her destiny, and Aisha chose love freely, not as a victim, but as a woman who knew her own worth. But before they stepped back into the world, one final chapter of transformation awaited them. They spent another week in the desert, planning, preparing. Malik opened his entire life to her, showed her his businesses, his accounts, his networks. He made her an equal partner in everything, legally and financially. He wanted her to know that this wasn't charity, this was partnership. And Aisha, for her part, began to understand the scope of what they could do together, the power they now held to change lives. When they finally returned to Lagos, it was not in secret. Malik had arranged a full escort, helicopters and security, and a convoy of vehicles that would make a statement no one could miss. They landed in Alaba in broad daylight, and the market once again ground to a halt. Aisha stepped out of the helicopter, and the crowd gasped. She was transformed, wearing an elegant dress that fit her perfectly, her hair styled, her skin glowing with health and confidence. She looked like royalty, but more than that, she looked like herself for the first time in years, free and unafraid. The whispers spread like wildfire. Is that Aisha, the groundnut seller? Impossible. But it was, and everyone could see it. Her uncle was in the crowd again, his face a mask of shock and greed. He pushed forward, his hand extended, trying to claim her, trying to take credit, trying to demand what he thought he was owed. But Aisha stopped him with a single gesture. She looked at him, this man who had taken everything from her, who had beaten her and starved her and sold her off like garbage. And she spoke clearly, her voice carrying over the crowd. She told him she forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because she was choosing peace. She told him he would receive nothing, no money, no access, no piece of her new life. She told him that his power over her was gone forever, dissolved in the light of her transformation. Her uncle stumbled backward, his face crumbling, and Aisha turned away from him without another glance. The crowd erupted in cheers, in applause, in celebration of a story that seemed pulled from folklore itself. But the world had not yet seen the full measure of Aisha and Malik's rising destiny. They began their mission immediately, pouring their resources into orphanages across Africa, building sanctuaries for children who had lost everything, just as Aisha once had. They created tech learning centres in the heart of the slums, places where street children could come and learn to code, to build, to dream beyond the limitations of their circumstances. They launched scholarship programs that sent hundreds of young people to universities around the world, silent philanthropy that changed lives without fanfare or recognition. Aisha became the face of their foundation, travelling to communities, speaking to children, sharing her story as a testament to the power of perseverance and kindness. She was no longer the neglected orphan selling groundnuts in Alaba market. She had become a beacon of hope, a symbol that transformation was possible, that the world could be cruel, but it could also be redeemed. Her kindness, which had once been her survival mechanism, had become her greatest weapon, and she wielded it with grace and purpose. Malik stood beside her, no longer hiding, no longer testing, but building alongside the woman who had restored his faith in humanity. Together they became a force that reshaped communities, that gave voice to the voiceless, that turned suffering into service. From the crowded streets of Alaba to the skies of destiny, Aisha's story teaches that kindness plants miracles, and destiny hides behind the unlikeliest faces. In a world that often rewards cruelty and cynicism, where the powerful crush the powerless and goodness is mistaken for weakness, Aisha's journey stands as a reminder that the truest strength lies in compassion, that transformation can emerge from the darkest places, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the beggar in the market is a king in disguise, waiting for someone brave enough to see the human beneath the rags. Her life, once defined by loss and suffering, became a testament to the redemptive power of love, proving that from the deepest poverty can rise the greatest purpose, and that every soul, no matter how broken or forgotten, carries within it the seeds of destiny waiting for the right moment to bloom.